Hey. Welcome to a world of laughter, learning, and entertainment. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of Nimzo-Indian Defence. We hope you find it enlightening. The Nimzo-Indian Defence is a chess opening characterized by the moves 1. Nc2. He3. Nkm. Other move orders, such as Ki Nc, are also feasible. In the Encyclopaedia of Chess Openings, the Nimzo-Indian is classified as E. This hypermodern opening was developed by Aron Nimzowitsch, who introduced it to master-level chess in the early 20th century. Unlike most Indian openings, the Nimzo-Indian does not involve an immediate fianchetto, although black often follows up with and. By pinning white's knight, black prevents the threatened 40,000 and seeks to inflict doubled pawns on white. White will attempt to create and develop their pieces to prepare for an assault on the black position. Black's delay in committing to a pawn structure makes the Nimzo-Indian sometimes colloquially referred to as the Nimzo, a very flexible defense. It can also transpose into lines of the Queen's Gambit or Queen's Indian Defence. The Nimzo-Indian is a highly respected defense is played at all levels and has been played by every world champion since Capablanca. White often plays Ug or Ernf to avoid the Nimzo-Indian, allowing them to meet Ernf, the Bogo-Indian Defence, with Ugd or Nd, rather than Ernk. In this segment, we'll be unraveling the complexities of general considerations and exploring its multifaceted nature. In the Nimzo-Indian, black is generally prepared to concede the bishop pair by playing sk. As dynamic compensation, they often double white's c-pawns, which represent a static weakness, and gains play against the central light squares d and e, even in those instances where white is able to recapture with the piece after sk. Black will aim to close the position to reduce the scope of white's bishops. To this end, black must blockade the white pawn center from advancing and neutralize white's attacking chances on the. An example of black's strategy carried out successfully is the game Mikhail Botvinnik-Samuel-Reshevsky from the 1948 World Chess Championship, which reached the position in the diagram after white's 24th move. Earlier in the game, Reshevsky was able to block white's king's attack by playing on Phi and F. Now, both white's bishops are reduced to defense, and white's queen is reduced to passivity at the square to defend the pawn's honor and k. Without prospects for counterplay, white's game is strategically hopeless, and black ultimately exchanged queens and won the endgame. Brace yourself for an in-depth analysis as we navigate through Rubinstein's system, 4000 and its far-reaching implications. The Rubinstein system, named after Akiba Rubinstein, is white's most common method of combating the Nimzo-Indian. Svetozar Grigory and Lajos Portish made great contributions to the theory and practice of this line at top level during their careers. White continues their development before committing to a definite plan of action. In reply, black has three main moves to choose from: 0, Urk, and Erb. In addition, black sometimes plays Erd or Ernk. The move Erd can transpose to lines arising from 0, but white has the extra option of E, known as the Botvinnik variation. This forces black to retreat the bishop to E or capture Onk, which transposes to a line of the Smish variation long considered good for white because they will undouble their pawns at some point by playing xt, eliminating the weak pawn Onk, then prepare the E-pawn break, backed by the bishop pair and in some cases with f, since they haven't committed the knight to that square yet, which will gain force in the more open type of position which will ensue. Unk is the Taimanov variation, named after Russian GM Mark Taimanov. Black prepares to play E, which may be preceded by Andik, Ord. The variation was tried several times by the young Bobby Fischer and has long been favored by GM Nukim Rashkovsky. Get ready for an enlightening exploration as we dig into 0 main line, 4000 00 Erbt and 70 and understand its role in the broader context. Black's most flexible and frequently played response is 0. The main line continues Erbt and 70, reaching the position in the diagram. White has completed their king's development, while black has claimed their share of the center. At this point, the most important continuations are Parma variation, Karpov variation, Larsen variation, main variation, Kassin variation, and Dvorak variation. Parma variation is named after Slovenian Grandmaster G.M. Bruno Parma, and can sometimes transpose to the Karpov variation if pawns are exchanged on. White usually continues with Ek, clearing the square for the rook, which will assist in the advance of the d-pawn. Black then faces an important decision. They may play with the intention of playing next at some point to isolate the d-pawn and blockade it, or exchange on as well to play against the isolated pawn couple. Or they can consider to grab space on the with In this case, black will usually retain there. After black also has two rare alternatives on their 8th move worth mentioning. Intending is the Smyslov variation, invented by former world champion Vasily Smyslov, and followed by is the Bronstein variation, the brainchild of two-time world championship finalist David Bronstein's Karpov variation, named after former world champion Anatoly Karpov, is one of black's most reliable defenses to the Rubinstein system. For the moment, white has an isolated pawn in the d-file. Even so, black plans to play at some point and follow up with burn Durac and to restrain white's c and d pawns. After the game usually continues when Ernie, Ari, and Ek are all good moves for white. The Larsen variation, named after G.M. Bent Larsen, can be reached by either Bay or Bay, but the latter move order gives white the extra option of Axp. The idea is to wait until white plays Dick before playing Ugsk. If white does not oblige, then black will play with pressure on the d-pawn. The point of inserting Dick before Bay is to prevent white from inflicting an isolated queen's pawn IQP on black by playing Xt. The main variation was enormously popular in the ERS, but the name has become increasingly inappropriate ever since. This is not because the line is bad for black, on the contrary, black equalists in all variations, but because white has a huge selection of moves to choose from, and black must be familiar with all of them. After white has tried trying to provoke before retreating the bishop, Ari, and Ek. Regardless of the move chosen, however, the basic strategic ideas remain similar. Black will play a quick to pressurized. If white has a bishop on, then black also threatens forking it and the knight on. White will try to advance their center pawns to free their bishops, and followed by are all possible. If black can prevent white from achieving this, then they will enjoy the better game. There are several move orders to reach the main variation besides the one given above. 4000 10-0 is one worth noting, because white may try Ernie instead. Is the Kassin variation, named after international master Abram Kassin. Xt is the usual continuation. White will try to build up a strong center with F and E, or they may play for a king's attack with F and black will try to restrain white's center as well as they can, ideally blockading it, before mobilizing their queenside pawn. The Vrbek variation was popularized by Vyacheslav Rigazin and Yuri Vrbek. The idea is to exchange pawns on and then bring the knight to and. The same knight may also move to defend the black king. This line has gone out of fashion since the ERS due to GM Svetozadligari's Gambit idea earned. With pressure along the queenside files and a potential square for the knight on. Without further ado, let's move on to the topic of zero lines with Ni. In general, the main line of the Rubinstein has held up very well for black, so since the ERS white has begun to look elsewhere for chances of obtaining an advantage. In the Rubinstein, white has often resorted to playing Ni rather than at some point to be able to recapture on with the knight, thus avoiding the doubled pawns. Two lines where white does this following 4000 Any Reshevsky variation any modern variation. Reshevsky variation was a specialty of GM Samuel Reshevsky. White will first player to kick the bishop away, before moving the knight on to a more active square. The main line runs any earbext when both ixt and nct are possible, the latter move leading to livelier play. GM Mikhail Gurevich is currently the foremost expert in the Reshevsky variation. Ernie and the closely related variant Ernie were collectively dubbed the modern variation by frequency modulation. Carsten Hansen in his book on the Rubinstein Nimzo-Indian. White again avoids the doubled pawns, but develops their bishop to the first so that it isn't blocked in by the knight on e. Black usually continues putting more pressure on white's center. While e and 7-0 are playable, the main line is ix 9-0, leading to an IQP position with white's knight on e rather than as is normally the case. This gives black the possibility of playing e at some point to completely liquidate the center, although the resulting positions are rather drawish. White's main options on their 10th move are e, putting the question to the bishop, and intending with an attack on. The time has come to unravel the secrets behind and gain a deeper understanding. Black puts pressure on it and leaves open the option of playing Ord and IE. The game can still transpose to the main line mentioned above after moves such as 0070, but there are two major variations particular to and any will likely transpose to the modern variation is the variation, popularized by GM Robert in the late and utilized by Bobby Fischer in his World Championship match with Boris Spassky in 1972 with great effect in Game 5. It is slightly unusual in that black captures on without waiting for white to play but this is because black intends to immediately set up a blockade on the dark squares with t and IE. This is feasible because white's knight is on. If it were on e as in some lines of the smish, white could quickly advance their king's pawns, but in the current line the knight must be moved away first. By closing the position, black is able to make their knights superior to white's bishops, and the doubled c-pawns deprive white of any pawn breaks on the queen side. It was the success of this variation that motivated the current tendency for white players to choose lines where the doubled pawns are avoided. When they do play into this line, white has two main setups to choose from. They may immediately close the center by playing 80,000 e, or play more flexibly with 80 e and 00, but black has full equality in both lines. Any the Rubinstein variation. This is why 4000 is properly referred to as the Rubinstein system or complex to avoid confusion is similar in spirit to the Reshevsky variation. White prevents black from doubling their pawns. After Ernie, black opens a path of retreat for their bishop with ix, and now chooses between and 0. Allows a typical continuation being Ernie Kingska. White's push created a queenside pawn majority, which black neutralized by playing a. Black will now try to destroy the rest of white's pawn formation by playing or IE, while white will try to use their lead-in development to create attacking chances on the king's head. The alternative is 0 e b. Here Kasparov played x a few times early in his career, increasing his space advantage further but falling behind in development. A safer move for white is Ernf. In this section, we'll be exploring favored by Nimzowitsch. Is a move in accordance with the spirit of the Nimzo-Indian. Black fianchettos the light squared bishop to increase their control over e. White usually continues Ernie, avoiding the doubled pawns, or continuing their development and usually transposes to The main variations emerging from these moves are Ernie Bay-Fisher variation, Ernie Krumenishin-Sakis variation, Ernie American variation, Ernie 0070, classical fianchetto variation, or toll variation, 0070, Keres variation, Ernie Dutch variation, Fisher variation. Ernie Bay aims to exchange light squared bishops after so that black can play on the light squares. Keres, Bronstein and Smyslov were early contributors to the theory of this line, and Fischer used it several times successfully. White may play ear, which was favored by Botvinnik, and asks the bishop on to clarify its intentions, or ing, which was invented by Reshevsky and prepares e. Nc3 was dubbed the Romanischen Psakis variation by Carsten Hansen because Oleg Romanischen and Lev Psakis were the two grandmasters who were primarily responsible for reviving the line and infusing it with new ideas. It can also arise via the move order 4000 Nc3. Black dares white to try and trap the bishop on the challenge white usually takes up, but rarely successfully. The American variation is another name invented by Hansen for the line Nini, as it was pioneered by G.M. Isaac Cashin and then developed by G.M. Bislayer, Anthony Santacier and currently G.M. Nick DeFermian. Black will exchange off two minor pieces and play if to keep he under control. Ernib is a rather passive line. White seems to obtain a slight advantage by continuing ear-beat, blocking in the bishop on and making I possible. The classical fianchetto variation, also known as the toll variation, can be reached through two move orders, 4000 and 0070 or 4000 00 and 70. It is a solid variation where white often holds the initiative early on, but black usually equalists in the end. White has two ways to attack black's setup. The first is to play x any followed by f and transferring the queen or rook to vf. This formation, known as the Pillsbury attack, blocks in the dark squared bishop and appears rather crude, but is actually quite dangerous. Black must create immediate pressure on white's center by playing it, and Ernie may be a handy move at some point to block the diagonal and perhaps exchange some pieces. The main alternative for white is Erb, which gains space on the queen side and makes it harder for black to free their position with k. The Keres variation, characterized by the moves Erb and 0070, is named after Estonian GM Paul Keres, although Smyslov and Bronstein were also early practitioners of this line. If allowed, black will play Ext and in the hope of leaving white with an isolated queen's pawn. Nowadays, white's most testing continuation is reckoned to be Erna, ducking the exchange on and threatening ear. The knight will often stay on for quite some time to assist in a potential push. After Ext, black often sets up a hedgehog formation pawns on a and e, while white will try to pursue a strategy of gaining queenside space with and k. The Dutch variation is so called because after Erb and Ni, black usually follows up with Erf with a position that resembles the Dutch defense tf. It is not a very common line, probably because white obtains good chances by playing 7-0, sacrificing a pawn to open up diagonals for their bishops. In this segment, we'll be unraveling the complexities of classical variation and exploring its multifaceted nature. The classical or Capablanca variation was popular in the early days of the Nimzo-Indian, and though eventually superseded by 4000 it was revived in the Urs. It is now just as popular as the Rubinstein. White aims to acquire the two bishops without compromising their pawn structure. The drawback is that the queen will move at least twice within the opening moves and that white's king's development is delayed. Thus, even though white possesses the bishop pair, it is usually advisable for black to open the game quickly to exploit their lead in development. Black has four common replies to k. These include 0, Erd, and Erd intending and IE is a rarer fifth option. 0 Erb is nowadays the main line of the classical variation, although Erb is a gambit invented by Olvis Tolley. Black's usual choice is Erb, but Erb is also possible to target the c-pawn, and Erb and Erk are sometimes played as well. After Erb, white's most straightforward move is preparing e, but black can counter with Erbed when the pawn grab Bay is very dangerous for white because of black's better development. Therefore, white has sometimes tried 8000 instead, when after Erbed Bay white has and so ok. Thus black should prefer 8000, planning Ermed and ik. Both players can deviate from the main line. Instead of erg, white can play inflict 8000, intending to develop the dark squared bishop to b. Another possibility is x00 50,000, although this is somewhat inconsistent with ek, as black might be able to double white's c-pawns at some point. The queen must guard e, something ek was supposed to prevent. After e-ek, black can also try ek, which is similar to the Dutch variation c4000, but without the doubled pawns for white. Ek exploits the fact that the queen no longer defends the d-pawn. If white defends the pawn, then black gets an easy game by keeping the pressure on, so white almost always plays dik. Black can choose to recapture with the bishop eg or 0 e, or with the knight after erna or 0 ernfna. In the former case, the bishop will eventually retreat to e and black will set up a hedgehog formation, pawns on a and e. If black recaptures with the knight, they will often have to give up the bishop pair at some point with but the knight is useful on and can later go to e, attacking the queen on dik 00. The Perk variation was one of the reasons why ek was not popular during the mid-20th century, because the lines where black eventually recaptures with the knight was reckoned to give black easy equality, while the line which prevented this maneuver, 10,000 left the black queen active, while white still needs to secure the king. It was the discovery of ergt, which revived this line for white, because the endgame after ergt offers white a slight edge. Indeed, Edmund Mednis's remark was that the entire Perk variation had become unplayable at the highest level, while modern chess openings MCO cites this variation as the main problem with erg. However, players like Kramnik have been willing to defend the black side of this line against players like Kasparov. Erg is another move that strikes immediately in the center, and was a favorite of Mikhail Botvinnik. After x, black can either recapture with the queen or pawn. Erg is the Romanician system named after Oleg Romanician. The idea is that after inflict x, black strengthens his grip on e and makes e available for the bishop, which is enough for him to obtain equality. White can avoid this with 6000 so that erg can be met with erg, but the e-pawn blocks in white's bishop. The older alternative is ix erg, which tends to be a rather sharp line. After erg, white can also play ix when black may play erg or intending ie. Even though white possesses the pair of bishops, black still strives for a quick opening of the position to exploit their lead in development. The usual result of this is a dynamically balanced position. Erg is the Zurich or Milner-Berry variation named after British chess player Stuart Milner-Berry. Black gives up the dark squared bishop, but places their central pawns on e so that their remaining bishop is unimpeded. To avoid moving their queen, white will play b at some point so that when black takes the knight, white can recapture with the bishop. Erg is out of fashion because most players prefer to avoid blocking their c-pawn. A topical line would go nf better than 5000, with the idea of playing e. Black often prepares this with castling and e or by playing k. After black plays e, white usually responds with d. Black is willing to lose a tempo moving the knight back to or e, which is often better because the position is closed. White usually plays on the queen side in this variation, while black will try to play on the king's with and possibly transferring the knight over to the king's after white's d. Today, the line arises quite often by transposition from the black knight's tango, e.g. In the following section, we'll be immersing ourselves in the captivating world of Kasparov variation, Ernf is known as the Kasparov variation, since Garry Kasparov used it to great effect against Anatoly Karpov in their 1985 World Championship match. Kasparov played Ernf 6 times, scoring 3 wins and 3 draws. Today as white, this is a favorite weapon of GM Alexei Barsov and former women's champion Nona Gaprindashvili. It is also sometimes known as the purely descriptive 3 knights variation. White develops the knight to a natural square and waits to see black's reply. transposes to the Bogo-Indian Defence of the Queen's Gambit declined, and transposes to the Nimzo-Indian hybrid line, so is the most common move that stays within Nimzo-Indian territory. Now 5000 transposes to the Rubinstein system, but the main move is which leads to a position that also rises from the fianchetto variation. Nc3 can be considered the main line. Black has dissolved white's center, but the bishop on exerts pressure on the black queen side, which white may augment with This line can also rise from the Bogo-Indian Defence if white blocks the check with Get ready for an enlightening exploration as we dig into other variations and understand its role in the broader context. This line has no generally accepted name, so is usually just referred to as the variation. It has previously been called the Gerdau variation, a name given by Gligori, named after Florin Gerdau, who often played it early in his career, even defeating Fischer, sometimes the Shirov variation, after Alexei Shirov, who used it with great success in the early years, before he lost 3 consecutive games with the line and abandoned it. It's also called the Kmok variation. It is a straightforward attempt to seize control of E at the cost of delaying development. Black's most common responses are Erd and Erk. After Erd, the most common continuation a position also reached from the Smish variation. Black's pressure on and compels white to play Dick, trying to open the position for their 2 bishops. White will follow up with E, and black will counter with A at some point to prevent white from pushing their E and F pawns further up the board. Another approach for black is to play Erk, after which white's most common move is to reach a Benoni-style position, and black's main replies are 0, and Ern. Instead of is a direct transposition to the Smish variation below. The Leningrad variation received its name because its theory was developed extensively by players from that city, such as Boris Spassky. Black can play all the immediate Erk. After, the game may go Here the main line is at 7000 key, when black has achieved a variation like blockade, the difference being that white's dark squared bishop is outside the pawn chain. The pin on the knight is very annoying, and black often breaks it by playing the drastic egg, which also clamps down on a potential break by white. This move weakens black's kingsid, so rather than castle on that side, black usually safeguards the king by playing Erk. An alternative to Erd or Erk is much played in the years after Mikhail Toll scored a crushing win over Spassky at Tallinn 1973. Here the Smish variation, named after Fritz Smish, is a direct attempt to refute black's strategic concept, as white gives up a tempo and concedes doubled c-pawns to gain the bishop pair. After black has several possibilities, the most common of which is to blockade the doubled pawns with Erk. Black will proceed to attack the pawn with the Mosber Bey, Unka and Erk. As compensation, white establishes a powerful center, which may provide a basis for a quick kingsid attack. The Smish variation was employed 5 times by Mikhail Botvinnik against Toll in the 1960 World Chess Championship, with 5 draws resulting, and once in the 1961 rematch, with a win for white. Subsequent practice has shown that white ultimately has difficulty obtaining enough kingsid played to compensate for the doubled c-pawns, so this variation is rarely seen nowadays. Instead of Erk, Erd is also possible, and transposes to the Botvinnik variation if white plays 6000. The Romanician variation or fianchetto variation resembles the Catalan system, where white fianchettos the king's bishop to control the central light squares. Black can play Erk with a position also reached from the Kasparov variation see above, but Erd is possible as well. This is considered the strongest response, since black can often take and keep the pawn on. This is not usually possible in the Catalan, where white's queen's knight can be developed to rather than and can then recapture on. The Spielmann variation is named after Rudolf Spielmann, who played it at Karlsbad, 1929, and was played at master level in the early years, though soon eclipsed in popularity by it. Like the classical variation ek, it avoids the doubling of white pawns. Unlike ek, the queen has no control over e, which black can exploit, e.g., by playing ek dik ni. Thus, despite the occasional revival by Vladimir Akopian, Vladimir Maliniak and Jeroen Piked, this variation remains uncommon. This move is relatively unambitious, simply unpinning the knight. The strategic aim of obtaining the without conceding the doubled pawns fails, for after e.g. white cannot retain both bishops, and trades are usually not in white's interest since white has an advantage. The Mykonos variation is named after Vladimir Mykonos. It supports the knight and brings the queen to a central location, but the queen is exposed making this variation rare. 40,000 The Dilworth Gambit, named for Vernon Dilworth, who contributed an article on the variation to the March 1949 issue of CHESS magazine. Dilworth's idea was Nc3 but this does not give white compensation for the pawn. The line accordingly never developed a following beyond Dilworth himself. Chris Ward calls the gambit critical, but basically rubbish. Let's zoom in on ECO codes and understand its implications. In the Encyclopaedia of Chess Openings, the Nimzo-Indian Defence has codes E to E. All codes begin with inflict, excluding E, which also includes alternatives to apart from which would be the Queen's Gambit declined. Inflict includes reminiscent variation of Nimzo-Indian, excluding Irsk, which is covered under E, and Kasparov variation, excluding Irk, which is covered under E, and E cover the Spielman variation, E cover the Smith variation, E 6000, E 00, E 00 6000, E 00 6000, and E cover the Leningrad variation, E includes 0. E cover the classical Capablanca variation, E Xericamuna buried variation, E E4000 includes Taimanov variation, E cover the Rubinstein system, E4000 includes the variation E4000, any Rubinstein variation, reminiscent Sekers variation via Bay E4000 includes Dutch variation. Kerr's variation E4000, any includes American variation, variation E4000, any Bay Fisher variation E4000, 00 includes Reshevsky variation E4000, 00 E4000, 00 includes modern variation E4000, 00 E4000, 00 and E4000, 00 and E4000, 00 and classical fianchetto variation E4000, 00 and includes Overbeck variation E4000, 00 and 70 includes Karpov variation, Bronstein variation, Smyslov variation E4000, 00 and 70 Palmer variation E4000, 00 and 70 includes Larson variation E4000, 00 and 70 Air E4000, 00 and 70 Air includes Kissin variation E4000, 00 and 70 Air includes main variation. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications.